Thank you, Dr. Kendi. Thank you so much for coming. It's amazing to see Gainesville show up, and Ibram, I know there's no love like that Gainesville love, so I hope you're feeling it, and we're so thrilled that you're back with us to discuss this book. I want to thank the library district. We have such an amazing public library system in so many areas from cradle to grave, and we thank them for hosting this event for us. And I also want to thank the city of Gainesville. This conversation is being recorded. We'll play it on Channel 12 and also have it available up on the web for anybody that wants to go back and look at it. And that's also a good reminder for us to keep it clean, sir. I have a bunch of questions and excerpts from the book that I'm going to ask Dr. Kendi to reply to and give some perspective on. I don't know that I'll get to all of them because we want to make sure that there's ample time for you to ask some of your questions as well. So I want to get right into it, not with any specific point or observation in the book, but about the structure of the book and the stylistic approach to the book itself, because it is unusual. Every chapter includes a personal narrative that helps the reader very directly relate to the experiences that Ibram faced at some point in his life. He then pivots to the historical that reinforces that, and then brings it to the analytical and the present. And I can't imagine how difficult this must have been as an author to write, but how effective it was for all of us trying to learn both from your personal experiences and your academic research. And so, Dr. Kendi, can you please share with us how you landed on this stylistic approach to the book, and maybe a little bit about the process that you went through?
Sure. So, good afternoon, everyone. I am deeply honored and humbled to be here, to be back in one of my homes, Gainesville. I actually started writing this book as a resident of Gainesville, as a professor at UF. And so I'm just truly thankful to be here and to discuss this book with the people who I was seeing each day when I started writing this book. And thank you, Mr. Mayor, for being in conversation with me. Of course, thank you to the library for hosting this event. So this book was incredibly hard to write. I mean, and especially compared to Stamped from the Beginning, which was, in my mind, quite easy to write, sort of a narrative history. But this one sort of blended multiple genres, and so in a way, it simultaneously was a personal chronological narrative, and then it was also a thematic chronological narrative. What I mean by that is each chapter was centered on a theme, and each theme built on the previous chapter's theme. And so it literally was building, ideas were building on each other over time in a way like, a novelist will sort of build out characters and build out a storyline. And then through those themes, they were also contextualized through history. And so I think the reason why we decided to write it in this way is because when we think about our sort of national and even local discussions about race and racism, for many Americans, it's deeply personal. And they can't really separate this conversation from their own personal lives, from their own personal ideas. They can't have an abstract conversation about race. And then simultaneously, when you think about race and racism, it is fundamentally an historical construct. And you can't really understand racism without understanding its history. Just like, for instance, you can't really understand why there's a growing racial wealth gap in this country without understanding both present and past policies. You really have to sort of understand both. And then, also, we thought it was critical to ensure that there were very clear and consistent concepts that were being shared throughout the book that would then give people the tools to really understand and navigate as an anti-racist in this world that trains us and nurtures us to be racist. And in order to do so, we felt we had to anchor the chapters on definitions. And we felt we had to start each chapter with those definitions and then flesh out those different definitions through personal story, through history, and even through data, as well as through sort of social commentary and analysis of our current moment. And we felt if we did not do one of those things, if we did not sort of use data, if we did not use personal narrative, if we didn't use history, if we didn't use definitions, if we didn't also comment on the racial concerns of our time, then we would essentially be providing an incomplete book on how to be an anti-racist.
Incredible. And for me, I know that the definitions that you provided at the beginning of every chapter helped me so much to set my both academic approach and my emotional approach to what I was about to read, to sort of open me up to what was going to be offered, and then it built on, as you said, every chapter built on the one before it, that felt like you were helping me grow and understand as I read through the book. So I'm going to read an excerpt. I think I just pronounced that incorrectly, but you understood me. If you're following along with me on page 54, the second full paragraph on that page, and then I'm going to read you an excerpt from my Facebook feed from yesterday. And I want to pull in what Dr. Kendi shared with us here, and then how that's relevant to us, and I'll give the professor a little context for why this post was made. So first, let me just read this, if you don't have a book. Assimilationists, this is from the chapter on biology, by the way. Assimilationists believe in the post-racial myth that talking about race constitutes racism, or that if we stop identifying by race, then racism will miraculously go away. They fail to realize that if we stop using racial categories, then we will not be able to identify racial inequity. If we cannot identify racial inequity, then we will not be able to identify racist policies. If we cannot identify racist policies, then we cannot challenge racist policies. If we cannot challenge racist policies, then racist power's final solution will be achieved: a world of inequity none of us can see, let alone resist. Terminating racial categories is potentially the last, not the first, step in the anti-racist struggle. So, a few nights ago, we had two students from the University of Florida, both black women, who were catching a ride home in the SNAP van. And the SNAP van, for those of you who don't know, is a service provided by the university for students to safely get around on campus, especially when it's dark and late. And it was both dark and late. It was at 2 in the morning. And both of these young women were assaulted by two other passengers on the van and called racial epithets and threatened with violence. It was reported in the Alligator. I posted a link to the story in the Alligator, just reminding our residents that this is not an abstract issue, but this is very real and happening in Gainesville right now, and perhaps a good motivation to come hear Dr. Kendi and learn more about how to be an anti-racist if this is something that troubles you. Almost predictably, in response to that post, it was not a confrontational post, it was an informational post. I'm going to read two excerpts from two of our local, well, they're certainly frequent commenters on my social media.
Oh, you have some of those folks too?
I have some of those folks, yeah. It's an incredibly challenging world, that social media. There is no place for racism within America anymore. People need not to see color. We need to appreciation, of all of us and understand what we have all different cultures, which is what makes the USA so great. And then just below it, racism is no longer a problem, except in the minds of progressives who like to foment discontent. It makes people believe they are needed to bring, end quote, justice, end quote. And there's lots more examples that I could share with you, but I think it would be helpful for all of us if you could dig a little bit deeper into this idea of a post-racial America or not, and the need to differentiate between the false construct that is race and the very real reality, the very real culture that we live in where racism permeates everything that we do.
Sure. So in that very chapter on biology, I was trying to think about a way to describe race. What terminology, what term could I use to describe something that geneticists have proven do not exist biologically and scientifically? Meaning there's no such thing genetically below our different colored skins as a white body or a black body or a Latinx body. In other words, there's no such thing as native blood or black blood or white blood or Latinx genes. These things don't exist. And in fact, geneticists have found that there's more genetic diversity within Africa. In fact, geneticists have found that there's more genetic diversity within Africa than between Africa and the rest of the world. In other words, geneticists have found that genetically, in other ways, below our skins, people in Western Africa are more genetically similar to people in Western Europe than they are to people in East Africa and Southern Africa. So this idea that there's this biological or essential construction of race doesn't exist. So race doesn't exist. But at the same time, it does exist in very real ways. And I think those two women probably realized that the other night, just like I've realized that when I've gotten pulled over by a police officer, or when I have basically been conceived of as somebody who is not going to basically be an individual. In other words, they're representing an entire race of people. Or the times in which I've been called racial slurs, or the times in which people looked at me and assumed that I was stupid. So it impacts people in very real ways. And so then how do we understand that? How do we understand something that doesn't exist, but then again, does exist? And so I decided, you know what? Race is a mirage. And so when we think of the construct of a mirage, right, it's something that we see while also knowing that it doesn't really exist. And I think that's the way we should understand race, is essentially it's something that we can see. Obviously, people see skin colors and they attach meaning to those skin colors. And people with certain skin colors are more likely to be impoverished, more likely to be incarcerated. Their votes are more likely to be to be suppressed. But at the same time, that really has no meaning. In other words, their skin color. I think that's a way in which we can sort of understand race. Now, sort of pivoting to the idea of this nation being post-racial. You know, when someone says to me that this nation is post-racial, my response is, okay, so how do you explain the fact that for the last 50 years, the black unemployment rate has been twice as high as the white unemployment rate? And typically, their response is, there's something wrong with black workers. There's only two explanations to that racial inequity. Either racism, i.e. racist policies, is causing that racial inequity, or there's something inferior or wrong with black workers. In other words, either there's employment discrimination, and that's leading to black people being twice as likely to be unemployed, or black workers are lazy, they prefer welfare over work, they're not qualified, and that's why they're more likely to be unemployed. And so typically when people are asserting that this nation is post-racial, a nation where we live with racial disparities and inequities all around us, what they are simultaneously saying is that the racial groups on the lower end of those disparities are on those lower ends because they are inferior, which is ironically stating racist ideas, which is ironically directly contradicting what they're saying. Right? But what's critical for us to know is people who express racist ideas swear that those ideas are what? Not racist. They say it's based on science, it's based on God's law, it's based on what they see, it's based on something, but they don't consider it to be racist. And the last thing I'll say about post-racial theory, and I think this is very, very serious, is in my work, I chronicle not just the history of racial progress, and we've been able to see that history, and we're constantly taught that history. But the history that we're not taught is the history of what I call racist progress, in which policies and ideas have become more sophisticated over time. The way policies become more sophisticated is essentially when you're able to institute measures that persistently discriminate against a particular group of people or lead to racial inequities, and nobody can see them, and nobody can resist them. That's what makes them more sophisticated. So, 100 years ago, people did not view grandfather clauses as racist policies. Just how you have people today like, what's wrong with those voter ID laws? Those aren't racist. Why everybody should just have their ID? And then when you tell them about, things like in Alabama, not only did they institute a voter ID law, but then they started shutting down DMVs in majority black counties, forcing residents who are black and mostly likely impoverished and most likely without forms of transportation to have to drive 100 miles, even though they don't have a car, in order to get an ID, in order to vote. They're like, oh, I didn't know that was happening. And so ultimately, I would argue that post-racial theory is the most sophisticated racist idea ever created. And very simply, the reason why it's so sophisticated is because unlike previous sets of racist ideas that force feed people what's inferior about particular racial groups, what post-racial theory does is it says to people, racist policies don't exist in a nation of racial inequity. So then it compels the individual to be like, okay, all these disparities around me, I can't explain them by saying there's racist policies, so I have to come up with my own racist ideas to explain those racial inequities. So what happens now is essentially, how medicine is becoming much more personalized, in which doctors are able to specifically create treatment plans for a single individual. It's the same thing with racism, in which literally individuals are coming up with their own racist ideas to explain their racial reality, which then makes it harder for us to undermine those ideas.
Wow, that's fantastic. So I'm on page 64 now, first full paragraph. I'm reading this excerpt because it is consistent with the theme and variations that you build on in every chapter. And so I just wanted to offer this to you to give you an opportunity to talk about how you come back to this basic theme throughout the book. So it reads, to be an anti-racist is to view national and transnational ethnic groups as equal in all of their differences. To be anti-racist is to challenge the racist policies that plague racialized ethnic groups across the world. To be anti-racist is to view the inequities between all racialized ethnic groups as a problem of policy. And what was so helpful to me is you came back to that basic framework every chapter, sometimes multiple times in a chapter, and distilled everything that you were introducing to us to this basic concept of this is what is racist, this is what is anti-racist in this area, and here's how you can both identify the difference and work to overcome them and change them. Can you help us through that a little bit?
Sure. So I think first and foremost, one of the reasons why I, in the text, had a chapter on ethnicity, I had a chapter on culture. there was a chapter on gender, there was a chapter on sexual orientation, on class, is because when we think about the racial groups, we shouldn't just be thinking about Latinx people and white people. We should be thinking about Latinx women and white men. Those are two distinct racial groups. And what's happening is their race is intersecting with their what? Gender. Just as you have black poor people and white elites. So in that case, you have race intersecting with class. And so when we think about racial groups, no one in this room, for instance, only has a racial identity. Everyone in this room either has a gender identity or is gender non-conforming, sits in a particular class, has a particular ethnic group, has a particular sexual orientation. And so what happens with race, and more so racist ideas, is racist ideas are constantly intersecting with other forms of bigotry. And so for instance, a black woman is not just facing racist ideas and sexist ideas. She's facing the intersection of racist and sexist ideas. And so in order for us to really be anti-racist, we can't just view, for instance, black people as equal to white people. We have to view poor black women as equal to rich white men. You see how that sort of happens? And in order to view poor black women as equal to rich white men, meaning what I mean by equal is equal, in other words, rich white men are not smarter, are not more, are not smarter than poor black women. They don't have more because they are more. And in order for us to recognize the equality between those two different racial groups, is we have to understand the ways in which racist ideas are intersecting with notions of gender and class. But, and then what we have to recognize is that there are so many different racial inequities. So there's not just racial inequities, for instance, between black people and white people. There's even racial inequities between black men and black women. There's racial inequity between white elites and who white elites call white trash. And then we have to think through, okay, are these inequities the result of there being something wrong with white trash or black women? Or is it the result of policy? And that's the fundamental question. When we think of any two racial groups, which one is on the higher end of a racial inequity or disparity, there's only two explanations for that inequity. Either it's the result of bad policy, or bad people should be on the lower end of that inequity. And we've been having this debate as a country since its beginning. During the enslavement era, you had people arguing that the reason why black people were enslaved is because black people are the cursed descendants of Ham. They're bad people. Is because black people, by their very nature, are more fit for servile labor than white people who are fit to be masters. Or that black people were these barbaric beasts living for thousands of years in Africa without civilization, and slave traders and ultimately slaveholders are civilizing them on the plantation. So there's nothing wrong with slaveholding policies. And there's everything wrong with the people. And we're having that same argument today over, for instance, immigration. Is the problem the policies, or is the problem that Latinx immigrants are murderers and rapists or criminals? Now, people like me, when you tell me that a particular group is criminal-like, what I do is I actually look at the evidence. And studies show that, in fact, American citizens are more likely to commit crimes than immigrants in this country. So, if Latinx immigrants are murderers, rapists, and criminals, then what are you saying about Americans? and so for me, I always sort of try to return to that point. These distinctions between these racialized ethnic groups, these inequities between these racialized gendered groups, these racialized class groups, what is the cause of that inequity? And what a racist says is the group has more because they are more. And what an anti-racist says is it's because of racist policy.
Excellent. Thank you. So two slightly unrelated but connected points. We're leaning on intersectionality here. Yesterday was Transgender Day of Remembrance internationally, and that intersection is very present and frightening to members of the transgender community, especially black transgender women. They are disproportionately victims of murder because of who they are, much more than any other group. And it's important, I think, for us to acknowledge that and understand that if it's difficult in America to be transgender, it's difficult in America to be black, it is lethal more often to be a black transgender woman in America. And therefore the policies to try to address that need to be carefully considered. And also I think we're in very real time learning about the very explicit criminality of very wealthy white people in positions of extreme power in America. We'll see how the system treats it. I know we're running low on the amount of time that I have, and we certainly want to make sure that we don't cheat you all on the amount of time that you have to ask questions. So I'm going to skip a few ahead a little bit, and I'm going to go to, I could not go to the chapter on success, because in what I do, both as an educator and a public servant, you must have hope and optimism, or the job gets undoable. Isn't that right, Gail? And so I want to read this excerpt. I think it was just a phenomenal summary of the thesis that you started out with. And then we'll get you to reply to that, and then we'll open it up for some audience questions. And then I would like to make a concluding remark or two once we reach the end of our time. So this is on page 226, very end of the chapter on success. You say, a mission to uncover and critique America's life of racist ideas turned into a mission to uncover and critique my life of racist ideas, which turned into a lifelong mission to be anti-racist. It happens for me in successive steps. These steps to be anti-racist. I stopped using the I'm not racist or I can't be racist defense of denial. I admit the definition of racist, someone who is supporting racist policies or expressing racist ideas. I confess the racist policies I support and racist ideas I express. I accept their source, my upbringing inside a nation making us racist. I acknowledge the definition of anti-racist, someone who is supporting anti-racist policies or expressing anti-racist ideas. I struggle for anti-racist power and policy in my spaces, seizing a policy-making position, joining an anti-racist organization or protest, publicly donating my time or privately donating my funds to anti-racist policymakers, organizations, and protests fixated on changing power and policy. I struggle to remain at the anti-racist intersections where racism is mixed with other bigotries, eliminating racial distinctions in biology and behavior, equalizing racial distinctions in ethnicities, bodies, cultures, colors, classes, spaces, genders, and sexualities. I struggle to think with anti-racist ideas, seeing racist policy and racial inequity, leveling group differences, not being folded into generalizing individual negativity, not being fooled by misleading statistics or theories that blame people for racial inequity. And I want to say to you, Ibram, that after reading Stamped from the Beginning, it allowed me, you gave me the opportunity and the space to understand my racist upbringings, my racist ideas that I had been surrounded by, taught, and nurtured throughout my life, and like all of us, many of us were wanting for so much more after Stamped. We were educated, we were enlightened, but we were frustrated. And then you came back with this that gave all of us hope that want to work to be more anti-racist in our daily lives, and certainly for those of us in a position of power to make sure that the policies we're implementing fit that anti-racist ideal. And so can you talk to us about the sort of hope that if we do these things that we as a nation can become a better people?
Sure. So, actually, I want to read the two sentences that came after that.
Sure.
Because it was probably two of the more difficult sentences for me to write in this book. And I wrote that racist ideas fooled me racist ideas fooled me nearly my whole life. I refuse to allow them to continue making a fool out of me, a chump out of me, a slave out of me. And the reason why I wrote that is because what I ultimately realized that racist ideas do to people is it indeed makes us into fools. It literally makes us into slaves. And when clearly if we are slaves, then that means someone's our masters. And then when we start thinking about, okay, how does that happen? How does racist ideas make us into fools, make us into slaves? Well, what happens is, for instance, to give an analogy, if you have a factory owner, and that factory owner has Black, Latinx, and white workers, and that factory owner is giving white workers $12 an hour, and that factory owner is giving Black workers $10 an hour, and that factory owner is giving Latinx workers $9 an hour, and all three sets of those workers should be making $35 an hour. And what's going to happen in the factory, and that factory owner, let's say, is white. That factory owner is stating to the white workers that I'm giving you more because we're both white. So you should make sure your allegiances are with me. And then many of those white workers are like, you know what? I'm happy that I'm making more than those Black and Latinx workers. So I'm going to keep my allegiances with you. Even though, again, all the while, they should be making $20 more an hour. And then, because their allegiances are with the white factory owner, certainly the Black and Latinx workers struggle to organize with them. And if anything, they become the shock troops for the white factory owner who is exploiting them. At the same time, he's hyper-exploiting those Black and Latinx workers. And then even those Black and Latinx workers begin to look at each other as enemies in the way they look at those white workers as enemies. And so all the while, all these people who should be making $30 an hour are not making $30 an hour because they view something wrong with Black people or Latinx people or even white people. They view these other people as their enemy, as their problem, as the reason why they're struggling. And so they continue to struggle. And the more they struggle, the more they hate each other. But who continues to win? The factory owner. I mean, that is essentially America. I mean, when you think of American history, that is essentially America. And what that ultimately says is racist policies have disproportionately harmed people of color, without question. And as a result, it's created white privilege. The privilege to make $13 an hour as opposed to $9 an hour. That is indeed a privilege. And that's a measurable privilege. That could lift someone out of poverty. But that's certainly not going to make somebody a billionaire. And so then those very people are like, you know what? I believe that one day I'm going to be a factory owner. Why? Because the factory owner is white and they're white. And so then they defend white supremacy in the way you had in 1860, 5 million non-slaveholding whites who were largely poor in the South, who were critical to maintaining the military apparatus that allowed for the enslavement of 4 million people. Now, they were poor. At the same time, you had a few thousand rich slaveholding families. And so instead of them allying with those 4 million enslaved people, what did many of them do? You know what? I want to be a slave owner. In the way you have people today want to be Donald Trump. And so what happens is they become fools. And they become slaves. That's the only way to really understand it, because their racist ideas have not allowed them to have intelligent self-interest, as opposed to unintelligent self. Because people are acting in their self-interest. They just don't realize that what they're doing is actually leading to their own struggles. And so ultimately, I have hope, because once people begin to realize, and once people have realized historically, that yes, white privilege is benefiting me, but a different type of America will actually benefit me more. And once people begin to start making that type of calculation, a different type of America where I'll be making $30 an hour, or when I would have the ability to own a factory, then, and then you also have those Black and Latinx workers who are constantly told by that factory owner, or even by the white workers, that the reason why you're making less is because you are less. And then some of them begin believing that. And then some of them begin attacking each other. Because again, they think that the problem is Black people. But then, I believe once those people begin to realize that there's nothing wrong with them, just as white people begin to realize that the type of America we're trying to build, an equitable America, will actually benefit the large majority of Americans, including Americans who are white. Once people begin to realize this, I feel like people are going to join this struggle intelligently. In other words, I'm not asking people to be altruistic, to be anti-racist. I'm simply, if you are not a super rich, politically connected, white heterosexual male, then you probably should be a part of this struggle. And let me just say, what I mentioned, this is not a light point. When I mentioned that you had poor whites in 1860 who wanted to be slave owners and who refused to challenge slavery, because to challenge slavery is to challenge their ambitions. It is difficult to convince people that what you want to be, you will never be. My father will tell you, in the 90s, I thought I was going to be in the NBA.
I tried to convince him.
He brought me, he did an intervention, and we went to see this film called Hoop Dreams, and that showed the likelihood being infantile, right, that I could make the NBA, but that was my dream. Just as you have so many people today who want to be so wealthy that they're untouchable, so powerful that they could sexually harass dozens of women and still not be touched, so beloved unintelligently that they could continue to basically create a scenario in which our democracy can essentially be determined by other countries, which last I checked wasn't necessarily good. People want this. I mean, you have so many Americans who just want to be free to do whatever they want. Just as when this nation was founded, and we can't escape this, you had white indentured servants whose idea of American freedom was very different than the founding fathers who wanted the freedom to enslave. And so we've had these warring ideals And I'm hopeful that those who are fighting for the freedom from oppression, the freedom from inequity, the freedom from tyranny will win out. And those who want the freedom to terrorize, the freedom to exploit, the freedom to make us into fools will one day lose.
And the congregation said. So we do have time for a couple questions. I'm tired. Let's go straight to the back and state your question. Then I'm going to repeat it because we are recording this, and then we'll ask Dr. Kendi, and we'll if we can remember that we're very much here to hear his thoughts. We can get together and talk about our own thoughts when he's not with us. But let's get right to the questions for him. And Doctor, if you can try to keep your answers as brief as possible so we can get as many people as we can. Go ahead.
Thank you. I don't know if you're aware, Dr. Kendi, but here in Alachua County, Gainesville, we have a shocking level of illiteracy. We have 70% of third graders who are Black not literate. In some schools, it's over 80%. Our city recently passed a motion to have all third graders reading on the grade level within 5 years. How do we, without just having a tool of literacy, how do we really change why this has been in place, and how do we prevent it from happening after we work really hard for 5 years to change it?
So to repeat the question, how have past racist policies led to lower literacy rates for our students of color, and what do we do to alleviate that disparity? Is that fair?
So, I think first and foremost, we're specifically talking about Black children. Like, a recent study came out that found that Black children actually perform better in the classroom with Black teachers. And so the first thing I would suggest is you essentially, as a city, going and rating the Black teachers in other counties. And getting the best Black teachers to come here. Now, folks ain't gonna like you, but that's one step. And again, there are more and more studies that are coming out that sort of show how and why Black teachers in particular are actually doing a great job with Black students. Secondly, I think it's critical when we come to teaching young people to figure out, to consistently ask, are we meeting these young people where they are? To give an example, I write about in Stand from the Beginning how in 1996, Oakland's school district decided that it was going to use Ebonics it was going to identify Ebonics as a language so that it can essentially teach students, quote, English through Ebonics. And what was happening is teachers were dismissing Ebonics and not viewing these students as bilingual. But once they essentially identified Ebonics and respected it as a language, and then essentially got students through Ebonics to learn to become more literate in English, they felt they'd be more effective. I think that's a type of way in which I think a school district can be more effective. But then also there are other ways, there are literacy sort of campaigns that are happening all over this country, particularly with Black children. And obviously I think the city and the school district and the school board can research those things and fundamentally say, the problem is not with these children. The problem is with how we teach these children.
That's the problem.
Yes, in the white shirt.
Yeah,
In the white shirt? Ma'am, in the white shirt? Ma'am, in the white shirt? Ma'am, I asked for the woman in the white shirt behind you. Ma'am, in the white shirt? Yes.
So I probably won't get this opportunity again, so I want to first say, Mayor Poe, you keep
I'm friends with Facebook. And so I really appreciate that we keep these conversations going across our city and just keep people talking about these things, so thank you for that. But, Dr. Kendi, I have a personal question to ask you about some of the things you talk about in your book. We're of a similar age, and I suspect that at around this age you get to the point where you start, in retrospect, questioning the things that our parents told us and how they raised us and how they brought us up. I had the pleasure of meeting your mom and father at events in the past, and I wonder because, to me, one, she kind of threw one of the buses. How has the conversation been with them after the fact, if they read the book, too, about what they may have done wrong when it comes to talking to you about race?
Okay, so the question is, how would you correct your parents' parenting? I can't wait to hear this. They're right down front here, by the way.
So yeah, I think my father could probably answer it better than me, but what I would say is I think, my parents had, so the book really tracks my own sort of conceptual journey, and I'm not the same person, that I was, let's say, in the 1980s and 1990s. And in many ways, my parents have been on a journey too, with me and even independently. And so I think probably because they're not in the same place conceptually that they were in the 1980s, it's easier for them to, I think, look back at that time in terms of what they were thinking. I also, one of the things that I wanted to do in the book was contextualize what they were thinking, but more importantly, why. Like, what was happening in a larger sort of society that was causing them to think a particular way and thereby to parent in a particular way. Because it's easy for us to just be like, there was something wrong with a particular person. It's yet another thing to really understand the context of what people were thinking. I tried to sort of do that in the text.
Thank you. Let's go back to this side. Yeah, go ahead, Faye.
Thank you, Dr. Kendi, for coming back today to the book. And thank you so much for this excellent book. I was stuck when I got to chapter 10, 11, and 12, when we talked about black racism. And I was like, no, it can't be. So can we talk a little bit more about that? Because we've seen some problems on the city commission with people going, as we say, the wrong way, with affordable housing and another issue. We're thinking, does that have to do with, and you don't know the situation, but a lot of people will not vote for another city commission or county commission. They're giving up hope in terms of elections. And some of that has to do with the black racism and the black classism. And we don't want to talk about it in public, but we talk about it behind. So please, if you could respond just a little bit to what you wrote in your book, because I think I'm reading something. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, so the question was about, so I talk about in the book whether black people can be racist, and I make a case that individual black people can be racist. And so of course people of color some people have not necessarily liked that, just as white people have not liked me creating this, arguing there's no such thing as being not racist. Because you have white people saying they're not racist, and you have black people saying they can't be racist. So then nobody of course looks in the mirror. But ultimately, one of the things that I wanted to sort of do, and I don't feel like I did this as well, but when black people say, and I say we because I used to say this, that black people can't be racist, they typically argue black people can't be racist because black people don't have power, or they say black people can't be racist because black people do not benefit from racism. And when we make those statements, we're actually saying two different things simultaneously. We're saying collectively, like as a group, black people can't be racist, but what we're also saying, and this is what I critiqued in the book, that every single individual black person can't be racist, because every single individual black person has no power. And so I argue, no, actually, there are indeed black people in policy-making positions. Now, there are very few of them relative to, let's say, white people, but there are indeed black people in policy-making positions, and I live near one of them, Clarence Thomas, who decided in the year 2000, when I was a freshman at FAMU, to basically state that black voters in this state, their votes were not spoiled, and there wasn't massive voter suppression in the 2000 election. He basically sided with the majority to state, no, that wasn't happening. So he used his power. In other words, if it was not for a black person, Al Gore could have been president. And so for us to deny that he had, to us to make a case that he had no power, right? Or, anyway, so, and then you also have black people in policy managing positions. And you have some black people who are like, you know what? I'm going to figure out private ways to undermine these policies I know are racist. And then you have other black people who are like, you know what? If I execute these racist policies against black people to the best of my ability, I'll get promoted. So then they do it. And for us to not recognize that distinction, and then the second thing, I'm sorry, this is very complex, is this idea that black people do not benefit from racism. Now, collectively, black people do not benefit from racism. But then the next question is, does an individual black person benefit from racism? So for instance, if I decided, I probably shouldn't say this, okay, the police officer left. If I decided to become a serial killer, but I specifically killed black people, would I benefit from the fact that my victims are black? Yes, no matter the race of the perpetrator. Just as there's a reason why R. Kelly is not in prison. Because his perpetrators, his victims were black women. If R. Kelly's victims were white women, I mean, y'all know what would happen. Right? And so that's a manifestation of the way in which individual black people can actually benefit from anti-blackness. And I think it's critical for us to sort of recognize that. And so I wanted to sort of interrogate that in the text. And so obviously I think it's launched a conversation within the black community. And let me just say that one of the reasons why for black people it's a very touchy conversation is because you have so many white people who want to say, you see, we've been telling you y'all are the racist all along, but they're going to say that regardless. I mean, are they not? You know, whether we admit the ways in which we think there's something wrong with black people or not, they're going to call us racist regardless. And so as far as I'm concerned, we should just tell the truth.
So we're very close to the end of our time. You can continue this evening at the Performing Arts Center at 5:30. And then even though Dr. Kendi must go on and enlighten other communities, it doesn't mean that we can't continue to have this conversation ourselves here in Gainesville. And so, Doctor, if you would just, I have one final question for you, for you to try to kind of bring this home and leave us with something to take with us. In your dedication, you didn't dedicate this book to a person. You dedicated it to an idea, and that dedication was to survival. Can you help us understand why you chose that dedication?
Sure. So yeah, the last chapter of the book is entitled Survival, and it chronicles. It begins with my wife's sort of fight against breast cancer. And it transitions into my fight against stage 4 colon cancer. And so last January I was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer with no risk factors. And one of the things that I wanted to sort of do in that chapter was sort of not only talk about how anyone, and I'm sure some people in this room who have been diagnosed with a serious illness or something tragic happened to you, or I should say to even someone else, and you just couldn't believe it. I mean, it's so bad that it's just so unbelievable. And so it is very, very difficult for Americans to really believe and admit that this nation is facing metastatic racism that's spread to every part of the body politic, and as a result, this country is dying. It's very difficult for Americans to admit how bad it is for this country and how bad it is for themselves. I mean, I think it's becoming easier through Trump, but I think for the most part, for many people, it's still very difficult. And that's indicative of when you're diagnosed with a serious illness and you don't have risk factors, it's hard, first and foremost, to admit that you have it. But that is essential to surviving it, to acknowledging that you have something, that you have a debilitating disease like stage 4 cancer. And then, of course, that next step is treatment. And I just talk about in the chapter how typically doctors treat metastatic cancer with both a local treatment. In other words, they surgically go in and remove the tumors, or they do radiation. That's a local specialized treatment, which is equivalent to us going in and removing racist policies where we see them. We've scanned the body. We see that these policies are leading to inequity, and we go in and remove those policies. But then doctors don't stop there. They're also like, you know what? We need to make sure that there's not a reoccurrence. Or if the tumors are so big they can't do a local treatment, then they do something to reduce the size of those inequities, to reduce the size of those tumors, which is equivalent to flooding the body with anti-racist policies. And so we can treat this nation's racism in the way we treat cancer. But in order for us to go through that extremely painful process, we have to believe that this nation and even ourselves can survive. Because when you're diagnosed with a serious, like my diagnosis, 88% of people die in 5 years. And so it's very easy for me to be like, I'm going to die. What's the point of even fighting against this? What's the point of doing 6 months of chemotherapy? That is extremely painful. What's the point of doing a surgery with 2 surgeons that have me on the table pretty much all day and I'm going to be out for months? What's the point of that when I'm going to die? And so it's easy for us to be like, it's permanent. Racism is permanent. Why even fight against it? Why even go through that pain? But to me, we have to believe that we can overcome racism, even though the odds are completely against us. And so when I said to survival, fundamentally it was to that essential, important hope that we can overcome the odds, that we can overcome the odds of history, of this nation's founding, of this nation's existence, and survive this metastatic racism.
Thank you. Can we please let